Nearly 3,000 meters beneath the Weddell Sea, in perpetual darkness and under crushing pressure, the three-masted wooden ship Endurance rests on the seafloor. Its waterlogged oak timbers remain intact, brass railings draped in pale anemones and the name Endurance still legible through a thin veil of silt. But this lightless grave is only the end of the story. To learn how the Endurance came to lie here, we must return to 1914, a time when wool and leather were the only defense against the cold. Empires still claimed blank spaces on the map, and those empty margins beckoned explorers with promises of glory. By the early 20th century, most continents and ocean depths were charted. Yet Antarctica remained an unconquered fortress of sub-zero cold, hurricane-force katabatic winds, and crushing sea ice. This crucible gave rise to the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. Frost-bearded Britons in woolen jumpers, Norwegians in reindeer furs, Germans in leather and canvas, all racing across the white desert not just for science but for imperial prestige. When Roald Amundsen planted Norway's flag at the South Pole in December 1911, he claimed a single point. When Robert Scott arrived 34 days later, he found only a tent and a letter, and then perished on the return. His final diary entry a testament to British stoicism. The pole had been reached, but Antarctica itself remained undefeated. There was still one great challenge left: to cross the entire Antarctic continent from one side to the other. 1,800 miles of wind-swept ice, crevasse-riddled glaciers, and temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in seconds. The man who would attempt this was Sir Ernest Shackleton, a broad-shouldered 40-year-old with penetrating eyes and a voice that could command loyalty in the harshest conditions on Earth. Shackleton had already traveled to Antarctica twice before, his weathered face bearing the marks of frostbite from previous expeditions. He had come within 97 nautical miles of the South Pole before turning back to save his starving men. A decision that prompted his wife to greet him with, "I would rather have a live donkey than a dead lion." In 1914, Shackleton announced the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition, the name emblazoned in bold type across recruitment posters throughout London. The plan was audacious. The sturdy wooden ship Endurance would push through the pack ice of the treacherous Weddell Sea, while Aurora, a converted sealer with reinforced hull, would approach from the Ross Sea, laying vital caches of supplies across the Great Ice Barrier. When Endurance departed Plymouth in August 1914, crowds waved Union Jacks from the harbor as war clouds gathered over Europe. At South Georgia Island, a craggy outpost where the stench of whale blubber hung in the air and blood-red water lapped at the shore, grizzled Norwegian whalers shook their heads at Shackleton's plans. "The ice is the worst we've seen in 20 years, they warned, their bearded faces grave. But Shackleton merely nodded, his jaw set with determination. In December 1914, Endurance sailed into the Weddell Sea, her wooden hull creaking against the crystalline pack ice that glittered like broken glass in the perpetual daylight. At first, progress was slow but steady, the ship nudging through labyrinthine channels between towering ice flows, sometimes idling for days while the crew scanned the horizon for openings in the frozen maze. By January 1915, the ice closed around them with the finality of a prison door. The once fluid ocean transformed into a solid white plain that stretched to every horizon, locking the Endurance in its merciless grip. In his journal, Shackleton's normally stoic handwriting betrayed tension as he confessed they had prepared for difficult conditions. But what confronted them was a frozen hell beyond imagining. Their meticulously planned continental crossing had evaporated like breath in the Antarctic air. Instead of conquering the white continent, 28 men now drifted helplessly on a frozen ocean that groaned and shifted beneath them like some great restless beast. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of Antarctica, the expedition's second vessel, Aurora, slipped away from Hobart's harbor. Her hull painted blood red against the slate-gray Tasmanian waters. She steamed toward McMurdo Sound with a crew tasked with laying supply depots across the vast emptiness of the Ross Ice Shelf, lifelines for Shackleton's crossing party. They arrived as the brief Antarctic summer waned, the sun's warmth already surrendering to autumn's approach. Inexperienced men and wide-eyed dogs stumbled across treacherous terrain, leaving trails of blood on the snow from split paws and frost-bitten fingers. Each night, fewer dogs returned to the makeshift camps, their frozen bodies abandoned on the ice, while the men's faces grew hollow with exhaustion and their skin blackened with the telltale patches of frostbite. Then disaster struck with the fury of the Antarctic gods. In May 1915, during a howling gale that whipped the sea into frothy peaks, Aurora wrenched from its moorings with a sound like tearing fabric. The ship became a prisoner of the drifting ice pack, dragging away the expedition's precious lifeline, crates of dried beef and pemmican, drums of kerosene, woolen underwear and fur-lined boots, delicate scientific instruments, all vanishing into the white wilderness. The 10 men abandoned on shore stood watching their salvation drift away until it was nothing but a dark speck against the endless white horizon. With hollowed cheeks and frost-rimed beards, these forgotten men gathered their meager remaining supplies, a handful of chocolate bars, some worn clothing, 3 tins of sardines, and faced the brutal reality of their situation. Thousands of miles from civilization, they salvaged what they could from the rotting huts of previous expeditions. Scott's moldy sleeping bags, Shackleton's abandoned sledges with their splintered runners. Despite blackened fingertips and toes that oozed with infection, despite gums that bled at the slightest touch, they continued laying supply depots across the treacherous crevasse fields of the Ross Ice Shelf. Cairns of food and fuel for a crossing party that would never arrive. Spencer Smith, the young biologist, died whispering of English gardens while Hayward and McIntosh vanished into a wall of white during a blizzard that lasted 3 days, their footprints erased by drifting snow before their absence was even noticed. Meanwhile, Aurora drifted helplessly in the pack ice, her wooden hull groaning under the pressure, until a sudden break in the flows allowed her escape to New Zealand. Back in the Weddell Sea, Endurance remained locked in winter's grip. Shackleton transformed the ship into a haven of warmth and light. The dog's hot breath created ice palaces in their improvised kennels, while inside the ship, the men's quarters glowed with the golden light of blubber lamps. On the frozen sea, men with frost-crusted eyelashes kicked a ball made of stuffed socks across the ice, their laughter creating puffs of vapor in the frigid air. They performed Shakespeare with costumes crafted from spare canvas, celebrated Christmas with hoarded plum pudding, and sang songs of home around a small harmonium. When the sun disappeared below the horizon for the final time, casting the world into a darkness broken only by the spectral dance of the Aurora Australis, the men huddled closer together. The ship's timbers protested continuously now, not just creaks but the sharp reports of wood under immense pressure, like distant gunfire. In his diary, written by the weak light of a blubber lamp, Shackleton's normally steady hand trembled slightly as he wrote, "What the ice gets, the ice keeps." The wooden hull of Endurance finally surrendered in October 1915. Massive ice floes squeezed her sides until timbers splintered with sounds like gunshots, and frigid seawater began flooding the lower decks. Men worked the pumps in exhausting shifts, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air, but the incoming water won the battle. On October 27th, Shackleton's voice cut through the wind. "She's going, lads. We'll have to get off." They hauled their precious cargo, tents, provisions, 3 lifeboats, onto the white wasteland surrounding them. For weeks, they camped beside their dying vessel until she slipped beneath the ice, leaving only emptiness where their home had been. Antarctica remained unconquered. Now 28 men faced a more primal challenge, staying alive. Shackleton plotted a desperate march toward Paulet Island, 346 miles distant. The men harnessed themselves to the heavy lifeboats mounted on improvised sledges and strained forward across the frozen landscape. But the ice betrayed them at every step. Jagged pressure ridges, hidden crevasses, soft snow that swallowed their boots. After a week of back-breaking labor, they had covered barely 8 miles. Shackleton's weathered face showed no disappointment as he called a halt and established what they would call Ocean Camp. Later, they dragged their sodden tents and supplies to a more stable ice floe and established what Shackleton grimly named Patience Camp. For endless months, they existed on the drifting ice, their world shrinking to the rhythm of hunting parties that returned with blood-streaked seals and waddling penguins whose flesh tasted of fish oil and desperation. The supply crates dwindled to splinters and empty spaces while the once magnificent Greenland huskies, now gaunt and restless, consumed precious rations that the men could no longer spare. Shackleton's weathered face betrayed no emotion when he finally gave the order, but his voice carried the weight of mountains as he instructed Crean to take the dogs behind a pressure ridge. The sharp reports of the pistol echoed across the ice, each shot punctuated by moments of terrible silence. That evening, as the Antarctic twilight painted the endless ice in shades of violet and gold, the men understood. They were no longer explorers charting new territories on maps. They were merely survivors adrift on a frozen, indifferent sea. After months on the ice, the floe finally fractured beneath them with a sound like distant artillery, forcing the men to launch their 3 weathered lifeboats into the slate-gray, freezing ocean. For 7 nightmarish days, they battled 20-foot swells that threatened to swallow them whole, their bodies crusted with salt and ice as waves constantly drenched their inadequate clothing. When they finally reached the rocky shores of Elephant Island, their hands were raw and bleeding from rowing. For the first time in nearly 500 days, they collapsed onto solid, unmoving ground, a desolate outcropping of black rock and glacial ice where nothing grew and gale-force winds howled continuously. But this forbidding speck of land offered no salvation. Elephant Island was merely a temporary haven in a vast, empty ocean where no passing ships ever ventured. Shackleton's weathered face remained impassive as he realized their only chance lay across 800 miles of the world's most treacherous waters. So Shackleton chose 5 men, the strongest and most skilled sailors among them, and prepared the 23-foot lifeboat James Caird for an 800-mile journey across the murderous Southern Ocean to South Georgia. They reinforced the boat's wooden hull with scavenged timber, sealed its seams with a putrid mixture of seal blood and lamp oil, and fashioned a makeshift deck from canvas stiffened with paint. Before leaving, Shackleton gripped Frank Wild's frost-roughened hand, his eyes glacier blue against his wind-burned face, and ordered him to keep the men alive and ready. If he did not return by spring, they should attempt the treacherous sail to Deception Island themselves. Then Shackleton and the boat crew, hunched in their stinking frozen furs, pushed the James Caird into the churning slate-gray ocean and disappeared into the towering waves. The remaining men on Elephant Island, their beards crusted with ice and salt, watched the tiny boat until it vanished beyond the horizon, swallowed by the vast emptiness. They did not know if they would ever see Shackleton again. Frank Wild, with his perpetually furrowed brow and quiet authority, maintained strict routines to preserve morale. The men hunted blubbery seals and waddling penguins with improvised spears, cooked over smoky blubber fires in their shelter made from overturned boats, scrubbed pots with pebbles and seawater, and even held small concerts with a salvaged banjo missing 2 strings. But as the bitter Antarctic weeks passed, hope began to fade like the weak winter sun. Food stores dwindled to alarming levels. The relentless darkness of another polar winter was descending. No ships appeared on the empty, threatening horizon. Inside the cramped boat hull hut, one of the men cracked a grim joke in a voice as hoarse as the wind outside. "We shall have to eat the one who dies first." The single tallow candle sputtered against the low ceiling, washing jagged shadows over hollowed faces. Though forced laughter rattled the walls, each man felt the cold blade of truth behind the words. A comrade's toes had blackened and frozen stiff. By candlelight, one of the ship's surgeons severed them with a dull blade. The stench of blood mingled with sea salt and sweat, and the man's muffled groans echoed like distant thunder in that little refuge of upturned planks. Each dawn they pressed themselves against the narrow slits in the hull, staring out at the vast expanse of crackling pack ice and churning gray waves. They did not know if Shackleton still lived, nor whether any rescue would ever come. Around them lay the ragged edge of the world, a wilderness of ice that creaked and sighed as if it might swallow them at any moment. Meanwhile, after 14 days of gale-racked seas and decks swept by towering swells, Shackleton, Frank Worsley, and Tom Crean staggered ashore on South Georgia Island, only to discover they had landed on its forbidding southern flank, far from the whaling station. Without a moment's rest, they plunged into a jagged landscape of glacier-scarred mountains and hidden crevasses. For 36 hours, they fought wind that cut like knives, their boots crunching on fresh snow, crampons biting into blue-black ice, every breath a cloud of vapor in the bitter air. Shackleton later wrote that hearing the steam whistle of the station was the first sound created by an outside human agency that had come to our ears since we left Stromness Bay in December 1914. He also confessed that during the crossing, it seemed to me often that we were 4, not 3, as though an unseen companion marched beside them through that frozen solitude. Back on icebound Elephant Island, Shackleton refused to abandon his men. He launched 4 relentless rescue attempts, each a desperate struggle against shifting floes and unyielding pack ice. The steamship Southern Sky battered its bow against drifting ice and was forced to turn back. A second vessel found its propellers entangled in brash ice. A third was beaten off by the same frozen sentinels. With each failure, Shackleton's hope wavered only briefly before steel resolved him to try once more. At last, the Chilean Navy lent him a squat, coal-black tug named Yelcho. Small, vulnerable, but built to punch through the ice's rigid lattice. On the morning of August 30th, 1916, a lifting fog revealed its dark silhouette against the white horizon. The men on Elephant Island, gaunt figures draped in furs, waved tattered flags and red lens lamps until the Yelcho drew alongside. Shackleton had come back. Every man was brought aboard. Despite frostbite, starvation, and despair, not a soul of the Endurance crew had perished. They sailed to Punta Arenas in Chile, where wind-swept streets filled with cheering crowds and brass bands heralded their return. But when they steamed home to war-torn Britain in 1917, the thunder of artillery and casualty lists drowned out any grand reception. The golden age of Antarctic exploration was ending, and the world had moved on. Shackleton arrived to whispers rather than trumpets. Today, the Endurance rests beneath nearly 3,000 meters of Weddell Sea, her timbers crushed into ghostly reef. Lost for more than a century, she lies encrusted in icy coral and remembered more by myth than by steel. Yet this story was never truly about a ship. It was about what her name embodied. Endurance, the stubborn ember that glows when all else is dark, the fierce will to survive when survival seems impossible. They set out to cross Antarctica. Instead, they endured it, and in the end, that endurance saved them. Shackleton's family motto rang ever true through the howling winds. Through endurance, we conquer.
Thus we went along, and thus we returned, having done a work that has resulted in great advantage to science, and for the first time returning without the loss of a single human life. And throughout all this, I was helped by a party of men who were regardless of themselves and only thinking of the good of the expedition. I, Ernest Shackleton, have today, March the 30th, dictated this record.